This audiobook reveals the hidden law behind manifestation, desire, and attraction. When you cling to something in fear, you push it away. If you want to learn how to manifest, you must first understand this. When you stop forcing life, opportunities, clarity, confidence, and transformation begin to move toward you naturally. Inside the Kybalion, the ancient Hermetic teachings reveal the hidden reason behind this law, and you will learn exactly how to do it. Let's begin. The Kybalion Introduction. There is a phrase the Hermetic tradition used to describe the transmission of its deepest teachings. The lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. It sounds elitist at first, the kind of thing a secret society puts above its door to make outsiders feel excluded. But when you sit with it a little longer, it's not elitism. It's a description of how genuine understanding actually works. The Hermetic tradition kept its deepest teachings close, not because it wanted to hoard power, because it understood that wisdom given to a mind that isn't prepared for it doesn't become wisdom. It becomes another set of concepts, another layer of the thinking mind's furniture. And concepts, however accurate, are not the same thing as the understanding they're pointing at. Chapter 1. The Principle of Mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. This is the first principle, the foundational one, the one everything else is built on. And it is also, if you take it seriously, the most disorienting statement in the entire book. Not because it's obscure, because it is so direct, so fundamental, so completely at odds with the assumption most of us carry about the nature of reality that the mind tends to slide off it rather than actually land on it. We hear it, we find it interesting, we move on. And in moving on, we miss the thing that the entire Hermetic tradition considered the master key to everything else. So before we talk about what the principle says, let's talk about the assumption it's challenging. Because you won't hear the principle clearly until you see the assumption it's dismantling. The water you're swimming in. Here's the story most of us absorbed about reality. Not from a book, not from a teacher, from the air, from the structure of the modern world itself. The universe is made of matter, physical stuff, particles, atoms, molecules, operating according to physical laws. It has been here for approximately 14 billion years, most of which it spent entirely without anything capable of observing it. Consciousness, awareness, mind, the felt quality of being alive and knowing you're alive, arrived late. Very late. After billions of years of purely mechanical processes had produced, through a long chain of biological accident, nervous systems complex enough to generate the curious and inexplicable phenomenon of experience. In this story, mind is downstream of matter. Consciousness is a product of the brain. The universe is fundamentally non-mental, rocks and forces and fields, and mind is a local, temporary, perhaps slightly anomalous property of certain sufficiently complex arrangements of matter. This is the story. Almost nobody chose it consciously. Almost everybody in the modern Western world lives inside it. And it has consequences for how we understand ourselves, for what we think is possible, for the texture of what it feels like to be alive in a universe that, in this story, was here long before you and will be here long after and has absolutely no inherent relationship to your existence in it. The Hermetic Principle of Mentalism looks at this story and says, gently, precisely, without drama, you have it backwards. what the principle actually says. The all is mind. The universe is mental. Let's be careful here, because this principle gets misread in two directions, and both misreadings miss the point. The first misreading is the dismissive one. Oh, it's saying the world doesn't exist. It's all in your head. Reality is an illusion. This is not what it's saying. The Hermetic tradition did not deny the reality of the physical world. It did not say that the chair you're sitting on is imaginary. The chair is real. The physical world is real. The Hermetic principle is not about whether the physical world exists. It is about what the physical world is made of at its most fundamental level. The second misreading is the overclaiming one. It means my thoughts create my reality. I can think whatever I want into existence. This is also not what it's saying, or at least not in the simplistic sense it usually gets taken. The principle is not a manifestation technique. It is an ontological claim, a statement about the nature of being. What it is actually saying is this: the ground of reality, the ultimate substance from which everything that exists emerges, is not matter. It is mind. Not a human mind. Not a personal consciousness sitting somewhere deciding what happens to whom. Something more fundamental than that. Something the Hermetic tradition called the all. The infinite, living, intelligent ground of existence itself. The everything that is, prior to any particular thing. And the relationship between the all and the universe of physical experience is, according to the Hermetic tradition, the relationship between a mind and its contents, between the awareness and what it contains. The physical world is not separate from the all. It is, in a sense almost too large to think, what the all is doing, what infinite mind looks like from the inside. The universe is mental not in the sense that it is imaginary, in the sense that its nature, the nature of what it ultimately is more like mind than like matter. The analogy that opens it. The Kybalion offers an analogy that helps, not as a proof but as a way of making the principle slightly less abstract. When you dream, your mind generates an entire reality. People, places, events, conversations, sensations. The characters in your dream have their own apparent independence. They do things you don't consciously direct. They surprise you. They resist you. The environment has its own apparent solidity. You can feel the ground. You can see light and shadow. You can be cold or hot or afraid. The dream world is real in the sense that the experience of it is genuine. You are having a real experience. And yet the dream world and everything in it is, at a deeper level, a manifestation of one mind. Your mind. Generating a world from within itself. The Hermetic principle of mentalism does not say the physical universe is exactly like a dream. It uses the analogy to point at something about the relationship between mind and world that is otherwise difficult to approach. The universe, it suggests, stands to the all in a relationship, something like the way a dream stands to the dreamer. Not identical, the analogy has limits, but structurally illuminating. The all generates the universe within itself, not outside itself. The universe is not something the all is looking at. It is something the all is, in a sense that the words barely reach, experiencing from the inside. And you, this particular arrangement of matter and consciousness that is reading these words, are not separate from the all. You are one of the forms the all has taken, one of the locations at which infinite mind is, temporarily and specifically, aware of itself. the part that changes things now. This is where the principle stops being philosophical and starts being personal. If the universe is mental, if mind is not downstream of matter, but in some fundamental sense prior to it, then the relationship between your inner life and your outer circumstances is not what the conventional story says it is. The conventional story says, things happen to you, and your inner life responds. The outer is primary. The inner is reactive. Your job is to navigate external reality skillfully enough to produce the inner states you want. The Hermetic Principle suggests something different. Not that the inner creates the outer in some simple, magical, wish-fulfillment sense, but that the inner and outer are not as separate as the conventional story assumes. That they are both expressions of the same underlying mind. And that what you are doing internally, the quality of consciousness you are habitually inhabiting, is not merely a private experience. It is a causal factor in the world, not a controlling one, not an omnipotent one, but a real one. The person who truly understands the principle of mentalism doesn't just think differently about reality. They take their inner life differently, seriously. They understand that the quality of their consciousness is not incidental to the world they live in. It is part of how the world they live in keeps becoming what it is. What modern physics found in the same territory. We get to the convergence. And I want to handle this carefully, because this is the territory where the temptation to overclaim is strongest. Quantum physics does not prove the principle of mentalism. Let me say that clearly. The equations of quantum mechanics do not contain the statement, "the all is mind." Anyone who tells you quantum physics proves Hermetic philosophy is overstating what the physics says. But here is what quantum physics does say, and it is genuinely relevant. At the most fundamental level of physical reality, at the level of quantum fields and the particles that arise from them, matter does not behave the way the materialist story says it should. Particles do not have definite properties, definite position, definite momentum, definite spin, independently of observation. Before measurement, they exist as probability waves, ranges of possible states. The act of measurement, the interaction with an observing system, is what collapses that range of possibilities into a specific, actual state. This is the measurement problem. It is not a philosophical position or an interpretation. It is what the mathematics of quantum mechanics shows and what decades of experiment have confirmed. The physical world, at its most fundamental accessible level, is not a collection of definite things with definite properties that exist independently of observation. John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century and one of the architects of quantum theory, followed the mathematics to its logical conclusion and found that the chain of physical causation in a measurement event could only be stopped at the level of consciousness. The act of observation that collapses the wave function is, in his analysis, ultimately a mental event. Eugene Wigner, Nobel laureate, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, took this seriously enough to publish on it. He argued that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality, not as a mystical belief, as a conclusion from the physics. Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, the man who started the entire revolution, said near the end of his life that he regarded consciousness as fundamental and matter as derived from it. He said he had spent his entire career studying matter and had concluded that behind matter was a conscious and intelligent mind, the matrix of all matter. These are not New Age voices. These are the most rigorous physicists of the 20th century, following their own mathematics to places that sound to an unguarded ear, exactly like the principle of mentalism. The all is mind. The universe is mental. They didn't use those words, but they were standing in the same territory. The hard problem doesn't go away. There is something else worth noting. Something that is, if anything, even more relevant to the principle of mentalism than quantum mechanics. For the last 30 years, one of the most significant problems in the philosophy of science has been what David Chalmers named the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness, explaining how the brain processes information, how it integrates sensory data, how it generates attention and memory and language, are not actually easy. They are extraordinarily complex, but they are, in principle, solvable by the methods of neuroscience. Find the neural correlates, map the mechanisms, explain the function. The hard problem is different. It is the question of why any of this physical processing should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does information processing in a brain produce the felt quality of redness when you see red, the felt quality of pain when you are hurt, the felt quality of recognizing a face, of hearing a piece of music, of being moved by something beautiful? The hard problem is not a gap in our knowledge waiting to be filled by better neuroscience. It is a conceptual problem. No amount of neural mapping, no matter how complete, no matter how precise, will ever explain why the physical processes it maps should be accompanied by experience. Because experience is not the kind of thing that physical description can capture. The description and the described are in different categories. The materialist story, mind as product of matter, cannot resolve this problem. It can explain the neural correlates of experience. It cannot explain the experience. The principle of mentalism resolves it immediately. If mind is primary, if consciousness is the ground rather than the product, then there is no hard problem. Experience doesn't need to be explained by physical processes because experience is what the fundamental nature of reality is. Matter is what mind looks like from a certain angle, not the other way around. This is not proof, but it is the right shape. It is the shape of an explanation that actually fits the problem. What it feels like from the inside. Here is the thing about the principle of mentalism that no amount of physics or philosophy can give you, but that changes everything when it is genuinely felt. There are moments, rare, usually unexpected, arriving in the middle of ordinary life rather than on command, when the ordinary sense of being a small, separate self, looking out at a large, indifferent world, goes briefly transparent. When something else becomes visible, a quality of aliveness in everything, a sense of the world as not merely existing, but somehow aware. Not in the anthropomorphic sense, not as though the chair is watching you, but in the sense that awareness seems to be what the whole thing is made of, and that the particular awareness you call yourself is not separate from that ground, but an expression of it. Meditators report it. People in nature report it. People in the midst of genuine grief or genuine love report it. Near-death experiences consistently include it. It is described in every contemplative tradition in the world, with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other, as the most real experience the human being is capable of having. More real than ordinary waking consciousness, not less. The Hermetic Principle of Mentalism is the philosophical framework for what those moments are pointing at. The universe is mental, not imaginary, not a hallucination. Mental, in the sense that its deepest nature is something more like mind than like matter, something more like awareness than like mechanism, something that the word consciousness barely reaches, but that every human being who has ever gone still enough and looked carefully enough has encountered. This is the first principle, the master key. Chapter 2. The Principle of Correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. As within, so without. As without, so within. The Kybalion. 4 phrases, 8 words each way. And yet this single principle, if you let it land fully, if you follow it into your actual life rather than filing it as an interesting idea, changes the entire way you understand your relationship to the world you live in. Most people encounter this phrase the way they encounter most ancient wisdom. They nod. They find it evocative. They move on. The words have a quality of profundity that makes them feel significant without requiring the listener to actually sit down with what they're saying. So let's sit down with it. The assumption, it's dismantling. Before correspondence can land, we need to see what it's pushing against. The modern world operates, in its medicine, its psychology, its economics, its politics, its everyday common sense, on the assumption that the inner and the outer are fundamentally separate domains. What happens inside you, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, your fears, your habitual emotional states, is private. It is happening in here. The world outside is happening out there. And while the two obviously interact, your feelings affect your behavior affects your circumstances affect your feelings. The interaction is understood as a kind of one-way traffic. The outer shapes the inner. You manage the inner well enough to navigate the outer. But they are not, at any deep level, the same thing. They are not mirrors of each other. The distinction between inner and outer is fundamental. The principle of correspondence looks at this assumption and says, not with aggression, with precision, the relationship is more intimate than that. The inner and the outer are not merely influencing each other. They are corresponding. They are expressions, at different scales and in different domains, of the same underlying pattern. As within, so without. As without, so within. What is happening in your inner life is not separate from what is happening in your outer circumstances. They are the same pattern, wearing different clothes. What correspondence actually means. The principle has 2 distinct dimensions, and most treatments of it collapse them into one, losing half the meaning. The first dimension is vertical. As above, so below. This is about the correspondence between different levels or planes of existence, what the Hermetic tradition called the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. The claim is that the same principles operate at every level. The laws that govern the movement of planets also govern the movement of thoughts. The principles that operate at the quantum level of matter also operate at the level of consciousness. The patterns of the large repeat at the level of the small. The nature of the part reflects the nature of the whole. This is the dimension the Hermetic tradition used most explicitly, and it is the one that has found the most surprising confirmation in modern science, which we'll come to. The second dimension is horizontal, as within, so without. This is the one that most directly touches the lived experience of the listener, and the one that the tradition treated as the most practically powerful. The inner and outer dimensions of your life are in correspondence, not in the simple sense that how you feel affects how you behave, which affects what happens to you. In the deeper sense that the quality of your inner life, the beliefs running below conscious awareness, the emotional states the nervous system defaults to, the story your mind tells about who you are and what is possible. These are not merely influencing your outer circumstances. They are structurally mirrored in them. The pattern within and the pattern without are, at some level, that current science is only beginning to map, the same pattern. The part that's genuinely uncomfortable. Let's stay with the inner/outer dimension for a moment, because this is where the principle either becomes genuinely useful or gets filed away as too inconvenient to think about. If the inner and outer are in correspondence, if the quality of your inner life is genuinely reflected in the quality of your outer circumstances, then looking at your outer circumstances tells you something specific and sometimes uncomfortable about your inner life. The relationship that keeps recreating the same dynamic, the financial pattern that persists regardless of the specific circumstances, the kind of conflict that seems to follow you across different contexts, the recurring theme in your professional life that shows up with different characters but the same essential plot. These are not random. They are not bad luck. They are the correspondence principle operating in exactly the way it describes. The pattern within is generating the pattern without. Now, this is the point where people either lean in or get defensive, and the defensiveness is understandable. It can feel like blame. Like the principle is saying that whatever difficult or painful circumstances you find yourself in are somehow your fault, your responsibility in some personal, culpable sense. That is not what it's saying. Responsibility and fault are not the same thing. The patterns the inner life generates in the outer world were mostly not consciously chosen. They were installed by childhood experience, by the accumulated weight of everything that shaped the nervous system before you had any say in the matter. The correspondence is automatic. It runs below the level of conscious intention. You are not to blame for a pattern you didn't consciously create, but you are the only one who can change it. Because the only place the pattern can be changed is where it originates, in the inner life. In the beliefs, the emotional defaults, the unconscious predictions about what the world is like and what is available to you and what you deserve and what is going to happen. Change those, genuinely, at the level where they actually live rather than at the surface level of behavior and positive thinking, and the outer correspondence changes with them. Not because you've manipulated circumstances, because the pattern has changed, and the pattern without follows the pattern within. The vertical dimension. Planes of existence. Now let's look at the other dimension. As above, so below. The Hermetic tradition divided existence into planes, levels or dimensions of reality that interpenetrate without being identical. The physical plane, the world of matter, measurable and tangible. The mental plane, the world of thought, belief, imagination, the inner life, and what it called the spiritual plane, the level of fundamental principles, of pure causation, of the underlying intelligence that the principle of mentalism described as the ground of everything. The claim of correspondence is that the same principles operate at all three levels, that what is true of atoms is true of solar systems, that what is true of individual minds is true of the collective mind, that the pattern of the part reflects the pattern of the whole. This is a large claim, but it has received some remarkable support from an unexpected direction. Fractal geometry. When mathematics found the same thing. In the 1970s and 1980s, the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot developed the mathematics of fractal geometry, the study of patterns that repeat at every scale of magnification. When you zoom in on a fractal, You find the same pattern you saw when you were zoomed out. Then zoom in further and you find it again. The pattern repeats across scales infinitely, not approximately. Exactly. What Mandelbrot discovered, and what has since been confirmed across virtually every domain of natural science, is that fractals are not a mathematical curiosity. They are how nature actually organizes itself. The branching pattern of a tree and the branching pattern of its roots are mirrors of each other. Both mirror the branching pattern of a river delta, of the human lung, of the bronchial tubes within it, of the blood vessels within those, all the way down to the capillaries. The spiral of a galaxy, and the spiral of a nautilus shell, and the spiral of the DNA molecule follow the same mathematical proportions. The turbulence patterns in a stream of water mirror the turbulence patterns of atmospheric weather systems. The same patterns at every scale of physical reality, from the subatomic to the cosmological. As above, so below. The Hermetic tradition described this as a philosophical principle 3,000 years before Mandelbrot gave it a mathematical form. And what Mandelbrot's mathematics makes clear is that the correspondence is not metaphorical or approximate. It is structural. It is how the universe is built. The part reflects the whole. The small mirrors the large. The pattern repeats at every scale. Quantum field theory and the correspondence. There is a second scientific convergence with this principle that is worth looking at carefully. In quantum field theory, the most complete physical description of reality currently available, everything that exists is understood as an excitation in underlying quantum fields. These fields are not separated by scale. The same field that operates at the quantum level of individual particles extends throughout the universe. There is no boundary at which the quantum field becomes something else. The same field underlies both the subatomic and the cosmic. This is correspondence in the most literal physical sense. The quantum field connecting a pair of entangled particles in a laboratory is the same field that connects stars in distant galaxies. The principle operating at the smallest scale is operating at the largest. The above and the below are not separate domains governed by separate rules. They are different expressions of the same underlying reality. The Hermetic tradition understood this through direct inquiry. Quantum field theory arrived at it through mathematics and experiment. The correspondence between the two is, as it keeps being across these 7 principles, genuinely striking. The practical heart of this principle. Everything we've covered, the fractal geometry, the quantum fields, the philosophy, points back to the same practical reality. Your inner life and your outer circumstances are in correspondence. Not because the universe is punishing or rewarding you, not because of karma in any simplistic moral sense, because of structure, because the pattern within generates the pattern without, as naturally and as inevitably as the fractal pattern of a branch generates the fractal pattern of the tree. It belongs to. This means 3 things practically. The first is that your outer life is always showing you something about your inner life, not as criticism, as information. The patterns that persist are the ones worth examining most closely, not to assign blame but to find the source. The source is always, in the Hermetic view, in the correspondence, in the inner pattern that the outer is reflecting. The second is that trying to change the outer without changing the inner is working at the wrong level. You can force a change in circumstances, a new relationship, a new job, a new environment, and for a while the new circumstance will feel different. But if the inner pattern hasn't changed, the correspondence principle means the outer will eventually recreate the same dynamic. Different cast, same story. The third, and this is the one that carries the most genuine hope, is that when the inner genuinely shifts, the outer must follow. Not immediately, not magically, but structurally, inevitably, as the correspondence between them reasserts itself around the new inner pattern. This is what genuine transformation looks like from the inside, not forcing new circumstances, changing the inner reality thoroughly enough that the outer correspondence rearranges itself to match. As within, so without, in the body. There is one more dimension of this principle that doesn't often get addressed, and it is the most immediate one. The correspondence operates in the body. The quality of your inner life, your emotional states, your beliefs, your habitual patterns of thought, is not just psychologically real. It is physiologically real. The chronic stress of a nervous system that has learned to brace against the world shows up in the body's tissues, in the hormonal environment, in the inflammatory profile, in the immune function. The quality of coherence or incoherence in the inner emotional life is directly reflected in the coherence or incoherence of the heart's electromagnetic field, the nervous system's regulatory capacity, the body's ability to repair and maintain itself. As within, so without, even at the scale of the individual organism. The inner and the outer are in correspondence right down to the cellular level. The HeartMath Institute has spent 30 years documenting this in the cardiovascular system. The field of psychoneuroimmunology has spent 40 years documenting it in the immune system. The research on adverse childhood experiences has documented it across entire populations, showing that patterns of inner experience laid down in the first years of life correspond, decades later, to patterns of physical health and disease. The body doesn't lie. It is always, in the most literal physical sense, expressing the correspondence between what is happening inside and what is manifesting outside. The principle that changes the question. Here is what the principle of correspondence ultimately does to a life. It changes the question. Most people, when something is persistently difficult in their outer circumstances, ask, what do I need to do differently out there? What action, what strategy, what change of environment will fix this? The person who has genuinely absorbed the principle of correspondence asks instead, what is this showing me about in here? What pattern within is generating this pattern without? What inner correspondence is this outer circumstance reflecting back at me? That is not a passive question. It is not an excuse for inaction. It is the most active, the most direct, the most honestly difficult question available, because it requires a quality of self-honesty that the outward-looking question never demands. But it is also the question that leads somewhere, because the outer correspondence cannot be permanently changed by working on the outer alone, and it can be changed, genuinely, lastingly, from the ground up, by working on the inner until the pattern there is genuinely different, as within, so without. It was true when the Hermetic tradition first stated it. It was true when Mandelbrot found it in mathematics. It is true in your body right now, in the relationship between your inner state and the quality of the life you are living. The correspondence is always operating. The only question is whether you are working with it consciously or letting it run on its own. Chapter 3. The Principle of Vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Of all 7 principles, this is the one that has received the most dramatic confirmation from modern science. Not a partial confirmation, not a suggestive parallel. A direct, precise, experimentally verified confirmation that goes all the way down to the most fundamental level of physical reality currently accessible to measurement. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. In 1908, when the three initiates published this as an ancient Hermetic principle, it was a philosophical claim. A statement about the nature of reality derived from direct inquiry into experience and from the accumulated wisdom of a tradition stretching back through centuries of careful observation. Today, it is quantum field theory. It is the standard model of particle physics. It is the most accurate description of physical reality ever produced by science. And what it says, when you strip away the mathematics and state it in plain language, is exactly what the Hermetic tradition stated 3,000 years ago. Everything vibrates. Starting with what we know. Put your hand flat on a table. It feels solid, completely still. The table is not moving. Your hand is not moving. Or if it is, that's a medical concern beyond the scope of this book. Now go a layer deeper. The table is made of wood. Wood is made of cells. Cells are made of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are made of a nucleus and electrons. And the electrons, the particles orbiting the nucleus, are not in fixed positions. They are in constant motion, occupying what physicists call orbitals, regions of space in which the electron is most likely to be found, but never actually stopping. Never actually still. At the atomic level, the thing that appears to be a motionless table is a buzzing, oscillating, ceaselessly active system of charged particles moving in patterns so fast and so small that the motion is invisible to every instrument available to ordinary perception. Go deeper still. The nucleus of an atom is made of protons and neutrons. Protons and neutrons are made of quarks. Quarks are bound together by the strong nuclear force, and the binding itself is not static. It is a dynamic equilibrium, a constant exchange of force-carrying particles called gluons, a continuous process of interaction and movement at energies that make the motion of electrons look sluggish by comparison. And beneath the quarks, beneath the protons and neutrons and electrons, what is the table actually made of at its most fundamental level? Not particles. Fields. Quantum fields, extended, invisible, pervading all of space, that are in constant fluctuation even in their ground state. Even in a perfect vacuum, with no particles present at all, quantum field theory says there is still activity. Vacuum fluctuations. Virtual particles appearing and disappearing on timescales so short they leave no trace but whose existence is experimentally confirmed and whose effects, the Casimir effect, the Lamb shift, are measurable with extraordinary precision. There is no such thing as a thing that is perfectly still. At every level of physical reality down to the most fundamental accessible to science, the universe is in motion. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. The Hermetic tradition described this from direct inquiry. Quantum field theory derived it from mathematics and confirmed it in the laboratory. The statement is identical. The spectrum of vibration. The Kybalion goes further than simply saying everything vibrates. It says that the difference between different kinds of things, between matter and energy, between dense physical substance and subtle mental states, between the body and the spirit, is a difference in the rate of vibration. Everything exists on a spectrum. At one end, the slowest vibrations, dense matter, the physical world as we ordinarily experience it. Moving along the spectrum, higher vibrations, subtler expressions. energy, thought, consciousness, spirit. This is not a hierarchy of value. It is a description of a spectrum. The way visible light exists on a spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that extends far beyond what the human eye can detect, below into infrared and radio waves, above into ultraviolet and X-rays and gamma rays. All of it is light. All of it is electromagnetic radiation. What differs is the frequency. The Hermetic tradition said the same principle applies to the whole of existence. What we call matter and what we call mind and what we call spirit are not three fundamentally different kinds of substance. They are different frequency ranges of the same underlying reality. Dense vibration, the physical world. Higher vibration, mental and emotional states. Highest vibrations, what the tradition called spirit, the dimension of pure causation, of intelligent principles, of what mentalism called the all expressing itself most purely. What this means for emotion. Here is where the principle stops being abstract and becomes immediately relevant. Your emotional states are vibrations, not metaphorically, not as a poetic way of saying they have a quality or a feel. Vibrations in the literal sense, patterns of activity in the nervous system, oscillations in the electromagnetic field of the heart, frequencies of electrochemical signaling in the brain. The HeartMath Institute, which we touched on in Principle 2, has documented this with extraordinary precision. The heart generates the largest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. That field extends several feet beyond the physical body, and its character, its coherence, its regularity, the specific frequencies it oscillates at, changes dramatically depending on the emotional state of the person. When a person is in a state of genuine appreciation, genuine compassion, genuine care, not performed, actually felt, the heart's electromagnetic field becomes more ordered, more coherent. The oscillations become regular, rhythmic, and, the research suggests, more resonant with the fields of other people in proximity. When a person is in chronic fear, anxiety, frustration, resentment, the field becomes erratic, incoherent. The oscillations are irregular, disorganized, and less resonant with the fields of others. This is not spiritual language dressed up as science. This is peer-reviewed research, measurable with instruments, reproducible across populations. Your emotional state is a vibrational state. It is not private. It extends beyond your skin. And it is in relationship, through the physics of resonance and entrainment, with the fields of everything around you. Resonance and entrainment. Two more physical principles worth understanding here, because they are what makes the Hermetic principle of vibration practically powerful rather than merely philosophically interesting. Resonance is the tendency of a vibrating system to produce a response in another system capable of vibrating at the same frequency. Strike a tuning fork at 440 Hz, the frequency of concert A, and any other tuning fork in the room tuned to 440 Hz will begin to vibrate in response. Not because you touched it, not because a physical signal was transmitted in any obvious sense, because resonance is a feature of how frequency works. Entrainment is the tendency of two oscillating systems in proximity to synchronize their rhythms. The Dutch physicist Christian Huygens first documented it in the 17th century when he noticed that pendulum clocks mounted on the same wall would eventually synchronize their swings. Over time, the clocks, influencing each other through the vibrations they transmitted through the wood, would fall into the same rhythm. This happens in biological systems constantly. The brain waves of people in genuine conversation tend to synchronize. The heart rhythms of people in close relationship tend to entrain to each other. Breathing patterns synchronize between people who are emotionally attuned to each other. The principle is simple, and its implications are large. Systems vibrating at similar frequencies influence each other. They tend toward synchronization, and the dominant vibration in a field tends to influence other systems in that field toward its own frequency, which means the vibrational state you inhabit, the emotional frequency your nervous system is predominantly running, is not a private matter. It is a broadcast. And the systems around you, including the people around you, are in relationship with that broadcast, are being influenced by it, just as you are influenced by theirs. Mental transmutation, the Hermetic art. The Kybalion calls the practical application of the vibration principle, and of several of the other principles together, mental transmutation. Transmutation is an alchemical term. The alchemists sought to transmute base metals into gold, to change the fundamental nature of one substance into another. The Hermetic tradition used the same term for the inner art of changing the vibrational quality of mental and emotional states. The transmutation of fear into courage, of grief into acceptance, of contraction into openness, of the lower vibrations of the spectrum into the higher ones. This is not toxic positivity. It is not the suppression of difficult emotions by forcing a more pleasant overlay on top of them. The Hermetic tradition was precise about this. Forced positivity is not transmutation. It is resistance. And resistance to a vibration tends to reinforce it rather than change it. Genuine transmutation, the actual shift in vibrational quality, requires something more honest and more demanding than performance. It requires the willingness to be fully present to whatever vibration is actually operating, to feel it completely rather than override it, and then, from that honest ground, to apply the understanding of polarity and rhythm and the other principles to find the natural direction of movement. The master of transmutation, in the Hermetic view, is not someone who maintains a state of permanent high vibration through sheer force of will. They are someone who understands the spectrum well enough to move along it fluidly, who can be fully present to the contraction without being consumed by it, who understands that every low vibration contains, within itself, its higher correspondence, because the principle of polarity, which we will address shortly, says every pole contains its opposite, and who has developed enough facility with the principles to move, with practice and patience, in the direction of greater coherence. The part modern science hasn't quite reached yet. Here is where honesty is required. Everything we've covered so far in this chapter, the quantum field theory, the heart's electromagnetic field, resonance and entrainment, is established science, documented, peer-reviewed, reproducible. The part that is not yet established, but that the Hermetic tradition treats as central to this principle, is the claim that the spectrum of vibration extends beyond the physical and the electromagnetic into dimensions that current instruments cannot measure. The claim that thought has a vibration, that consciousness has a frequency, that what the tradition calls spirit operates at rates of vibration that go beyond anything the current toolkit of science can access. This is where the principle requires a different kind of engagement. Not belief. The Hermetic tradition did not ask for belief. It asked for direct investigation, for the willingness to turn the question inward and look at the actual quality of different states of consciousness, the way a scientist looks at a physical phenomenon, carefully, honestly, with attention to what is actually there rather than what you want or expect to be there. And what that investigation tends to reveal, across cultures, across centuries, across the testimony of those who have looked most carefully, is that states of consciousness do have a quality that the word vibration, however approximately, describes. That there is a felt difference between contracted, fearful, defended states and open, loving, clear ones that goes beyond psychology. That the highest states, what the contemplative traditions variously call grace, illumination, non-dual awareness, the ground of being, have a quality of aliveness and clarity and, for want of a better word, resonance, that the ordinary states do not. Whether this is a literal difference in vibration, in the physicist's sense of oscillation frequency, or whether vibration is the best available metaphor for something that genuinely has no other name, the Hermetic tradition was honest enough not to pretend it knew which. It offered the principle as a description that fit the phenomenon. The complete explanation remained, then as now, at the frontier. The practical consequence. Here is what the principle of vibration says to you, directly, in the middle of an ordinary life. The state you are in is not private. It is a frequency the world around you is in relationship with. The people you encounter, the opportunities you perceive or miss, the quality of your thinking and your creativity and your capacity for genuine connection, all of it is in relationship with the vibrational quality of the state you habitually inhabit. This is not an invitation to perform a higher state you don't actually feel. That is not transmutation. That is suppression. And suppression tends to reinforce whatever is being suppressed. It is an invitation to become genuinely curious about your own states. To notice, without judgment, with real attention, the quality of the vibration you are actually in, most of the time, in the ordinary moments. Not the peak experiences, the baseline, the default frequency. Because that baseline is the broadcast. That is what the correspondence principle says the outer life is reflecting. That is what entrainment says the people around you are being influenced by. That is what the principle of vibration says you are contributing to the field every moment you are in it. And that baseline can change. The brain is plastic. The nervous system learns. The heart can be trained toward greater coherence through practice. Specific, documented, teachable practice. The vibrational quality of a life is not fixed. It is a current expression, and current expressions can be changed. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates, including you, including the state you're in, including the frequency you're running right now as you listen to these words. The question the Hermetic tradition leaves with you at the end of this principle is not a difficult one. Is the vibration you're running the one you would choose if you understood that it was a choice? Chapter 4. The Principle of Polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything is its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. This is the principle that most directly challenges how most people relate to themselves. Not philosophically, personally. In the middle of a difficult day, in the middle of a difficult year, in the middle of the particular struggle that has been sitting with you longest. Because the principle of polarity says something that is simultaneously deeply uncomfortable and genuinely liberating. The thing you are fighting, the fear, the anger, the grief, the quality of feeling that you most wish you could eliminate from your inner life is not your enemy. It is the same energy as the quality you most admire in yourself, expressed at a different point on the same spectrum. You are not at war with an alien force. You are in relationship with a different degree of something that is, at its root, the same thing. That changes the whole approach. What the principle actually says. The Kybalion's statement of this principle is the longest of the 7, and it is worth unpacking carefully because it contains several distinct claims that are easy to miss if you read too quickly. Everything is dual. Everything in existence has 2 poles, 2 extremes. This is not a feature of some things. It is a feature of the structure of existence itself. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. This is the heart of it. What we call opposites, hot and cold, love and hate, courage and fear, light and darkness, are not 2 different things. They are 2 ends of a single continuum, the same quality at different intensities. Extremes meet. Push any quality far enough in one direction, and it begins to loop back toward its apparent opposite. The person of extreme kindness who never says no eventually generates resentment in themselves and confusion in others. The person of extreme discipline who never rests eventually collapses. The ascetic pushed far enough becomes indistinguishable from the hedonist in the quality of their obsession. All truths are but half-truths. Every statement that captures something real about the world is true from one angle of the spectrum and incomplete from another. The person who says life is suffering is describing one pole. The person who says life is joy is describing the other. Both are true. Neither is the whole truth. All paradoxes may be reconciled. What appears contradictory, what looks like 2 incompatible things being simultaneously true, almost always resolves when you see that the apparent contradiction is not between 2 different things, but between 2 points on the same spectrum. The misunderstanding that costs the most. Most people experience their inner lives as a battleground. There are the states they approve of: confidence, love, clarity, peace, generosity, courage, and the states they don't: fear, anger, grief, jealousy, shame, despair. And the project of self-improvement, as most people understand it, is the project of increasing the first category and eliminating the second. Which is understandable. Some of those states are genuinely painful. Some of them generate behavior that causes harm to yourself, to people around you. The desire to be rid of them is completely natural. But the principle of polarity says this approach is working against the structure of how things actually are. You cannot eliminate a pole. The spectrum is not a thing you can cut in half and keep only the pleasant portion. The pole you fight gets louder, not quieter, because resistance requires engagement, and engagement feeds the thing you're resisting. What you push against, you strengthen. What you suppress, you preserve. The fear you fight remains fear. The anger you shame yourself for remains anger, with the additional weight of shame added to it. The grief you refuse to feel stays in the body, frozen, preserved, continuing to generate the same signal it would have generated if it had been allowed to move. This is not just ancient wisdom. It is documented psychology. The research on emotional suppression consistently shows that the effort to suppress a feeling does not reduce it. It amplifies it. The suppressed emotion requires ongoing effort to keep suppressed. Metabolic effort, cognitive effort. the constant low-level work of not feeling what is there to be felt. And when the suppression fails, as it periodically must, what emerges is typically more intense than what was suppressed. The Hermetic Principle of Polarity offers a completely different approach, not suppression of one pole, not fighting to eliminate what is uncomfortable, understanding the spectrum, and transmutation, the movement along the spectrum, as the only genuine form of change available. How transmutation actually works. The Kybalion says the master of polarity is not someone who has eliminated the lower poles from their experience. It is someone who understands the spectrum well enough to move along it consciously rather than being tossed between its extremes by circumstance. The practical key is the recognition that the poles are not separate things. Fear and courage are not two different qualities. They are the same quality. Call it response to risk. Call it energy in relation to the uncertain, at different points on the same spectrum. The person who is genuinely courageous is not someone who has eliminated fear. It is someone in whom the energy of risk response has been transmuted to a higher frequency on its own spectrum. The fear is still there. It has become the edge of alertness, the sharpening of attention, the signal that something matters. Anger and righteous commitment are not two different things. They are the same energy at different frequencies. The person whose anger has been transmuted is not someone who no longer feels intensely about injustice. It is someone in whom the intensity has been refined into the kind of sustained, clear, directed energy that actually changes things rather than merely burning. Grief and love are not two different things. Grief is love without an object. The intensity of the grief exactly mirrors the intensity of the love. You cannot have one without the other being possible. And the transmutation of grief is not its elimination. It is its movement along the spectrum toward the appreciation, the tenderness, the profound gratitude for what was. That genuine grief eventually becomes when it is allowed to move rather than frozen in place. This is the Hermetic art of polarity, not the war against one's own spectrum, the fluid, honest, courageous movement along it, the neuroscience of polarity. Modern emotion research has arrived at something structurally identical to this principle, though it took a different route to get there. The psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, whose work on the construction of emotion has significantly reshaped how neuroscientists think about feeling, has documented something the Hermetic tradition described as polarity. Emotions, in her framework, are not discrete categories, fixed things called fear, anger, grief, joy, that exist as natural kinds in the brain. They are constructions. The brain takes raw physiological data, arousal levels, valence, the body's internal state, and constructs an emotional experience by interpreting that data through the lens of past experience and current context. What this means practically is that the same raw physiological state, the racing heart, the heightened alertness, the intensity of activation, can be experienced as fear in one context and excitement in another, as threat in one frame and challenge in another, as the paralyzing anxiety before a difficult conversation or the energizing anticipation before something you're looking forward to. The raw signal is the same. The construction differs. This is polarity in neurological language. The same energy, interpreted differently, experienced differently, generating different behavior. And because the interpretation is, at least partially, within the individual's capacity to influence, the movement along the spectrum is real and available. The research on cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate reinterpretation of an emotional situation, has documented this effect with considerable precision. When people are guided to reappraise a threatening situation as a challenge, the physiological response remains, but its character changes. The energy is the same. The frequency has shifted. As above, so below. As within, so without. And as one pole to the other. Everything is dual, even this. There is something worth sitting with about the meta level of this principle. Polarity applies to the principle of polarity itself. The recognition that fear and courage are the same energy is genuinely liberating. It dissolves the shame around being afraid. It removes the war against the self that comes from believing we need to eliminate a quality that is, in fact, an expression of the same energy as something you value. And it can also become a way of avoiding genuine change. Everything is dual, everything has its poles. This can become a story that justifies staying where you are. The anger doesn't need to change. It's just the lower expression of righteous commitment. The fear doesn't need to be worked with. It's just the lower expression of courage. The principle is not a permission slip for stasis. It is a description of the structure within which movement is possible. The Hermetic tradition was clear about this. Understanding that you are on a spectrum does not mean you stay where you are on that spectrum. It means you stop fighting the spectrum itself and start learning to move along it. The direction of movement is still toward higher frequencies, toward the expressions of each quality that produce more coherence, more genuine connection, more contribution. The principle of polarity doesn't change the direction. It changes the method. Not war. Transmutation. Not suppression. Movement. Not the elimination of what you find difficult. The gradual, honest, patient refinement of the same energy into a form that serves you and the people around you more completely. The poles in relationship. One last dimension of this principle deserves attention, because it is the one most directly felt in the quality of human connection. The principle of polarity applies between people as readily as it applies within an individual. What irritates you most intensely in another person is almost always something that exists in you, at a different point on the same spectrum, expressed differently, perhaps suppressed, or perhaps simply unrecognized. The Jungian shadow is, in part, a description of the lower poles of your own spectrum that you have disowned and therefore tend to perceive as existing exclusively in others. The person whose anger makes you most uncomfortable often carries a quality that you have suppressed in yourself. The person whose dependency disturbs you often mirrors a neediness you haven't allowed yourself to acknowledge. The person whose arrogance infuriates you often expresses, at one pole, a confidence you haven't given yourself permission to embody. This is not always the case. Sometimes another person's behavior is simply difficult, and the appropriate response is a clear boundary. But the quality of emotional charge, the specific, personal intensity with which certain qualities in others land on you, is almost always a correspondence with something in your own spectrum that hasn't yet been acknowledged. The principle of polarity in relationship is an invitation to curiosity rather than judgment. To ask, when something in another person produces a strong reaction, not just what is wrong with them, but what in their spectrum is corresponding to something in mine. That question is not comfortable, but it is usually more productive than the alternative. The closing question this principle leaves. The Kybalion's treatment of polarity ends with a remarkable statement. It says that the person who understands this principle has a key to transcending apparent contradictions, to finding the place where opposite truths meet and become one truth seen from a higher vantage point. This is not a small thing. Most of what feels most stuck in a human life has the quality of an irresolvable contradiction at its core. I want freedom, and I want security. I want to be seen, and I want to be safe. I want to give, and I want to receive. I want to be loved for exactly who I am, and I want to become more than I currently am. These feel like contradictions. They are poles. And the principle of polarity says that every apparent contradiction of this kind can be resolved, not by choosing one pole and suppressing the other, but by finding the level of the spectrum at which both poles are expressions of the same underlying quality, and inhabiting that level. Freedom and security are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same need for integrity, for a life that matches the inner reality. At a sufficient depth of self-knowledge, both are expressions of the same thing. Being seen and being safe are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same need for genuine connection. Connection that doesn't require the suppression of any part of you. At a sufficient depth of inner security, both are available simultaneously. Giving and receiving are not opposites. In a system of genuine connection, they are the same movement seen from different positions. All paradoxes may be reconciled, not through clever thinking, through movement along the spectrum to a place where the paradox resolves into the unity it always was. That is the principle of polarity, in all its discomfort and all its liberation. Chapter 5. The Principle of Rhythm. Everything flows, out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. There is a particular kind of suffering that doesn't come from the difficult period itself. It comes from believing the difficult period is permanent. The contraction after a period of expansion. The creative drought after a season of productivity. The flatness that follows an emotional high. The withdrawal that arrives unbidden after a period of intense connection. These feel from the inside like they are going to stay. Like the tide has gone out and something is wrong, and it might not come back. The principle of rhythm says, with the patience and precision of something that has been observing this pattern for as long as there has been anything to observe, it comes back. It always comes back. Not because the universe is kind, though perhaps it is, because rhythm is the structure of existence, and the pendulum that swings one way must swing the other. This is one of the most immediately useful of the 7 principles. Because most human suffering around the natural oscillations of life comes not from the oscillation itself, but from the misidentification of a phase as a permanent condition. The structure of the principle. The Kybalion statement of rhythm is more detailed than most of the others. Every phrase is doing something specific. Everything flows out and in. Not just one direction. Not a linear progress from one state to another, better state. A continuous flowing in both directions, in and out, back and forth. The universe does not move in straight lines. Everything has its tides. The ocean's tides are perhaps the most visceral example available to ordinary experience. The reliable, rhythmic, completely indifferent alternation of high and low. The water always returning. The pattern consistent across scales from the daily tide to the monthly spring tide to the seasonal variations. The universe tides. Everything in it tides. All things rise and fall. Civilizations, relationships, careers, seasons, the levels of energy in a single human day. Everything that rises will fall. Everything that falls will rise. The pattern is not failure. It is the structure. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. This is the precise part. The amplitude of the oscillation is consistent. A pendulum swings as far one way as it swings the other. The depth of a contraction corresponds to the height of the expansion that preceded it, or that will follow. The intensity of the low corresponds to the intensity of the high. Rhythm compensates. The universe balances its own oscillations. What swings far one way will swing equally far the other. This is not a moral principle. It is not saying that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished in some cosmic accounting. It is a structural observation. The pendulum compensates, always. What this explains about your life. Think about the patterns in your own experience for a moment. The period of intense creativity that is followed, almost inevitably, by a period of apparent emptiness. The time of deep connection that is followed by a need for solitude that can feel from the inside like withdrawal or loss. The high of a significant achievement that gives way, often surprisingly quickly, to a flatness that the achievement seemed to promise would not arrive. Most people experience these oscillations as something going wrong. The creativity returns, great. The drought arrives, something is broken. The connection deepens, wonderful. The withdrawal comes, the relationship is failing, or you are failing it. The achievement lands, briefly satisfying. The flatness follows. The achievement didn't mean what you thought it would. The principle of rhythm reframes every one of these experiences. The creative drought is not evidence of permanent creative failure. It is the contraction phase of the creative rhythm, the pendulum at the far extent of one swing, preparing to return. The need for solitude after intense connection is not withdrawal. It is the natural rhythm of a system that has extended itself and needs to return to itself. The flatness after achievement is not evidence that achievement is meaningless. It is the natural settling after a peak, the wave returning to the level of the sea before the next wave builds. None of this makes the difficult phases comfortable. The drought is still dry. The withdrawal still feels like loss. The flatness is still flat. The principle of rhythm does not eliminate the experience of the low phase. What it eliminates is the suffering that comes from believing the low phase is permanent, from catastrophizing a phase into a condition, from treating a tide as a drought. The biological rhythms. Here is where the principle of rhythm becomes not just philosophically interesting, but empirically verifiable in the most immediate personal way possible. Your body is a system of rhythms, not one rhythm, dozens of overlapping, nested, mutually influencing oscillations operating simultaneously at different timescales. The most fundamental is the circadian rhythm, the approximately 24-hour cycle that governs virtually every system in the human body. Body temperature, cortisol levels, melatonin production, immune function, cognitive performance, emotional regulation, physical strength. All of these rise and fall in rhythmic patterns across the day, coordinated by the body's master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. This is not a metaphor for the principle of rhythm. It is the principle of rhythm operating in the body at the biological level. Your body tides every single day. And the quality of that tidal movement, whether the circadian rhythm is well regulated or disrupted, has profound consequences for everything from mood to metabolism to immune resilience to cognitive function. Beneath the circadian rhythm is the ultradian rhythm, the approximately 90-minute cycle of the brain's basic rest activity cycle. Approximately every 90 minutes, the brain moves through a phase of higher activation and focused processing toward a phase of reduced activation and more diffuse, integrative processing. The focused phase is where directed work happens most effectively. The rest phase is where integration, consolidation, and the kind of associative thinking that produces insight tend to occur. Most people in modern life override the ultradian rhythm constantly. They push through the rest phases with caffeine and willpower and the cultural pressure to remain productive. And in doing so, they disrupt not just their performance, but the quality of the biological rhythm that underlies it. The principle of rhythm, applied to the ultradian cycle, says, the rest phase is not laziness. It is the other half of the rhythm. It is where the integration happens that makes the next focused phase possible. Fighting it is working against the structure of how the brain actually functions. Beyond the circadian and ultradian, the seasonal rhythms, the hormonal cycles, the rhythms of sleep architecture, the rhythms of appetite and satiation. The body is not a machine that maintains a steady state. It is a system of oscillations, nested within oscillations, all tiding in and out in patterns that predate any individual human being by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything has its tides. The rhythm of creative work. The principle of rhythm appears nowhere more clearly and is more consistently misunderstood than in the creative life. Every person who has ever made anything seriously has encountered the rhythm. The periods of flow, when the work arrives easily and the quality is high and the connection to the source of the work feels open and direct, and the periods of apparent drought, when nothing comes, or what comes is poor, or the connection to the source feels severed, and the work that was effortless becomes effortful and then becomes impossible. The conventional response to the drought is to try harder, to force the work, to push through the resistance, to treat the dry phase as a failure of discipline or commitment or talent rather than what it actually is, the contraction phase of the creative rhythm. The pendulum at its far extent, about to return. The principle of rhythm says the right response to the creative drought is not force. It is faith in the rhythm. Not passive waiting. The principle does not counsel passivity, but the kind of active, directed patience that understands the structure of the oscillation, that tends the conditions for the return rather than thrashing against the current direction of the tide. Feed the work in the drought with input, reading, observing, conversing, allowing the mind to range freely rather than demanding output from it. Trust that what is going in is being integrated, that the rest phase of the rhythm is doing the work of consolidation that will make the next flow phase possible. And let the drought be what it is rather than what the anxious, productivity-fixated mind insists it must be, evidence of permanent failure. The tide always returns. The Kybalion says this. The neuroscience of creativity says this. The incubation phase, the apparently fallow period during which the brain continues to process and integrate outside conscious awareness, is a documented feature of the creative process, not an interruption of it. Rhythm compensates. The rhythm of emotional life. The same principle applies to emotional experience, and with perhaps even more practical urgency. Grief moves in waves. Every person who has experienced genuine loss knows this. The wave of grief arrives, often unbidden, often at unexpected moments, with an intensity that can feel overwhelming, and then it recedes. And for a period, there is a quality of relative stillness, and then the wave returns, sometimes more gently, sometimes, especially in the early phases, with undiminished force. This is not malfunction. This is the rhythm of grief doing exactly what it is supposed to do, moving through the system in the oscillating, tidal way that the organism processes significant experience. The wave is not the problem. Resisting the wave is the problem. Because resistance requires the system to hold the wave in place rather than allowing it to move through, and held grief is preserved grief. The principle of rhythm in emotional life is the permission to let the waves move, not to provoke them unnecessarily, not to amplify them by dwelling in the story around them, but to let them come when they come, to be fully present to the intensity of the phase, and to trust, not as a comfort, but as a structural understanding of how the rhythm works, that the wave will recede, it will return, and recede again, and return with somewhat less force, and recede again. This is how emotional processing works when it is allowed to work. The tidal movement, given room to oscillate, gradually finds its way toward equilibrium. What prevents this? What keeps grief frozen? What keeps anxiety chronic? What keeps anger perpetually activated? Is almost always some form of resistance to the oscillation. The refusal to let the wave come, or the refusal to let it go when it does come, clinging to the intensity because it feels like the only honest relationship to what was lost. The principle of rhythm says both resistances, resisting the arrival of the wave and clinging to it when it arrives, interrupt the natural movement of the tidal rhythm, and that the wisdom available in understanding the rhythm is the wisdom of allowing the oscillation to complete itself. The Master and the Pendulum. The Kybalion's most interesting claim about the principle of rhythm is about the possibility of what it calls mastery in relation to the pendulum's swing. It says that while the ordinary person is tossed by the pendulum, swung high by the rising phase and low by the falling phase, experiencing both as things happening to them from outside, the person who understands the principle can develop a quality of inner stability that the swings of the outer pendulum do not fully reach. Not by stopping the pendulum. The pendulum cannot be stopped. The rhythm of existence is not something an individual can override. By establishing an inner ground that is deeper than the reach of the swing. A quality of equanimity, not detachment in the sense of not caring, but stability in the sense of not being swept away, that can be present with the full range of the oscillation without being entirely at its mercy. The Stoics called this equanimity. The Buddhists called it equanimity too, upekkha, and treated it as one of the 4 foundational virtues. The Christian contemplative tradition called it detachment or interior freedom. The Taoist tradition called it the still point at the center of the turning world. All of them were pointing at the same quality, not the elimination of the rhythm, the deepening of the ground below it, the development of an inner stability that can be present with what rises and falls without being entirely defined by either. This is not a small thing to ask of a person. It is one of the most demanding forms of inner work available. And it is, the Kybalion says, the practical goal toward which the understanding of rhythm is pointing, not the transcendence of the rhythm, the freedom within it, the longer rhythms. There is one more dimension of this principle worth sitting with before we close. The Kybalion speaks of rhythm at every scale, from the oscillations of subatomic particles to the tides of civilizations. And it suggests that the principle applies to the larger arcs of a human life as readily as it applies to the daily cycle of energy or the tidal movement of a creative period. The periods of a life that feel from the inside like stagnation, when nothing seems to be moving, when the work is not coming, when the relationships are not deepening, when the sense of direction has gone quiet. These are, in the Hermetic view, phases of a longer rhythm, periods of apparent stillness that, like the rest phase of the ultradian cycle, are doing underground work. Consolidation, integration, the subterranean growth that precedes a new phase of visible movement. The 30-year-old who cannot yet see the shape of what they are becoming. The person in the middle of a genuine transition who has left one chapter without yet entering the next. The creative who has completed something significant and finds themselves in the quiet that follows, not yet knowing what comes next. And that the quality of attention you bring to the in-between phase, whether you thrash against it or inhabit it with some degree of trust and patience, will influence the quality of what emerges from it. Not because the universe is watching and rewarding the patient, because the still phase, inhabited well, does work. It prepares the ground. It allows the integration that the active phase cannot accomplish. It gives the next movement room to become what it needs to become before it breaks the surface. Everything flows, out and in. Everything has its tides. Rhythm compensates. Trust the rhythm. Chapter 6. The Principle of Cause and Effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. Nothing happens by accident. That sentence is either deeply reassuring or deeply uncomfortable, depending on where you are in your life when you encounter it. Sometimes it is both simultaneously, because on one hand, a universe governed by cause and effect, a universe where nothing is random, where every event is the consequence of prior causes and every event in turn becomes a cause of future effects, is a universe that makes sense. A universe you can work with. A universe where understanding the causes gives you genuine influence over the effects. Where the inner life, understood as a causal factor rather than a private irrelevance, becomes something worth attending to with serious care. On the other hand, a universe where nothing escapes the law of cause and effect is a universe in which you are the cause of more of your circumstances than is comfortable to acknowledge. The principle does not let you have the reassurance without the responsibility. They come together. What the principle actually claims. The Kybalion statement is careful, and it is worth unpacking precisely. Every cause has its effect. Not some causes. Every cause. Everything that happens produces consequences. There are no sterile events, events that occur and leave the world exactly as they found it. Every stone dropped into the pond produces ripples. Every thought, every feeling, every action, every state of being ripples outward in ways that are often invisible to the person who produced them. Every effect has its cause, not some effects. Every effect. Nothing comes from nothing. Every circumstance, however random it may appear, however coincidental, however like pure luck, is the effect of prior causes. The causes may be numerous, may be distant in time, may be operating at levels of reality that are difficult to observe, but they are there, always. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. This is the most philosophically significant phrase in the principle. What we call chance, what we call coincidence, luck, accident, random, is not the absence of causation. It is causation operating through mechanisms we haven't yet identified. The appearance of randomness is a feature of our ignorance about the causes, not of the absence of causes. There are many planes of causation. This is the Hermetic edition that takes the principle beyond simple physical determinism. Causation operates at the physical level, the level of forces and matter and the mechanics that Newton described. But it also operates at the mental level, the level of thought, belief, attention, intention, emotional state, and at what the tradition called the spiritual level, the level of deep principles, of fundamental patterns, of the underlying intelligence that mentalism described as the ground of all. Nothing escapes the law. The principle is universal. There is no dimension of existence, no scale, no plane, no domain, where the law of cause and effect does not apply. Even the highest spiritual states operate within it. Even the most fundamental principles of existence are themselves the effects of prior causes and the causes of subsequent effects. The plane of causation that changes everything. Physical causation is familiar. You push something, it moves. You drop something, it falls. The causes are visible, the effects are predictable, and the whole thing maps onto Newton's laws with the kind of comfortable clarity that most people associate with how causation works. The plane of causation the Hermetic tradition was most interested in, and the one most people most consistently overlook, is the mental plane. The quality of consciousness you habitually inhabit is a cause, not a cause in the distant, abstract sense that everything is connected to everything else if you go back far enough. A proximate cause, a direct, immediate, continuously operating cause of the quality of the life you are living. Here is what that actually means in practice. The beliefs running beneath the surface of your conscious awareness, the ones that were installed before you had any say in the matter, the ones the brain is using to generate its predictions about what the world is like and what is available to you and what is likely to happen. These beliefs are causing things. They are causing you to notice certain opportunities and filter out others. They are causing you to respond to certain situations in characteristic ways, regardless of your conscious intentions. They are causing the emotional tone that other people pick up in your presence and respond to, often without either of you being aware of the transaction. The stories you tell about yourself, not the ones you tell consciously for effect, but the ones that run automatically in the background, the self-concept that the default mode network is continuously generating and maintaining, these stories are causes. They are causing the quality of your attention. The quality of your attention is causing what you perceive. What you perceive is causing the choices available to you. The choices available to you are causing the circumstances that accumulate over time into what you experience as your life. This is not a short causal chain. It is a web of causation operating simultaneously at multiple levels. But it has a consistent feature that the principle of cause and effect makes visible. The inner is upstream of the outer. Why this is not determinism. The principle of cause and effect in its simple Newtonian form produces determinism, the view that everything is fixed in advance by prior causes, that free will is an illusion, that the future is already written in the initial conditions of the past. The Hermetic principle is not determinism, and the distinction matters enormously. Newtonian determinism operates on a single plane, the physical. Causes at the physical level produce effects at the physical level in a closed, mechanical loop. There is no entry point for consciousness, no place where the inner life can influence the outer, because the inner life is itself entirely the product of physical causes at the level of brain chemistry. The Hermetic principle of cause and effect operates across multiple planes simultaneously, and the multiple plane structure means that causation is not a closed loop. It is an open system in which causes at the mental plane can influence effects at the physical plane, and causes at what the tradition calls the spiritual plane, the level of deep understanding, of genuine insight, of the quality of awareness brought to bear on a situation, can influence causes at the mental plane. This is where genuine freedom becomes available, not freedom from causation. Nothing escapes the law, but freedom within causation. The freedom to move up the planes of causation, to bring the influence of understanding to bear on the quality of the mental causes being generated, and through those mental causes to influence the physical effects that accumulate over time into the quality of a life. The person who is entirely at the mercy of the physical plane, whose inner life is simply the product of physical brain states, and whose physical brain states are simply the product of prior physical causes, has no genuine freedom. They are being caused. The person who has developed genuine awareness of the mental plane, who can observe the beliefs and emotional defaults running in the background, who can bring the quality of attention to bear on them, who can work with understanding to shift the causal patterns operating at that level, has moved up the planes of causation. They are not free from causation. They are operating at a higher plane of it. They are causing rather than merely being caused. This is what the Hermetic tradition meant by mastery, not the transcendence of cause and effect, the movement to a higher plane of it, the neuroscience of mental causation. Modern neuroscience has been documenting the causal power of mental states with increasing precision, and what it has found maps onto the Hermetic principle with remarkable specificity. The reticular activating system, the brain's relevance filter, operates as a direct causal mechanism between belief and perception. What you believe determines what the brain filters for and presents to conscious awareness. The person who believes opportunities are scarce will perceive a world of scarcity, not because the world contains no opportunities, but because the belief is causing the brain to filter them out before they reach conscious awareness. The perception is not a neutral reading of the available data. It is a caused selection from the available data, shaped by the beliefs upstream of it. This is mental causation operating in the most immediate biological sense. The belief causes the perception. The perception causes the available choices. The available choices cause the actions. The actions cause the circumstances. The circumstances confirm the belief. The loop is closed, and it is a loop of mental causation, not merely physical. Epigenetics has opened another dimension of mental causation that is, if anything, more striking. The discovery that environmental signals, including sustained emotional states, chronic stress, the quality of social connection, influence gene expression without changing the underlying DNA sequence, means that the mental plane of causation reaches all the way into the biological. Your habitual inner states are not merely influencing your perceptions and choices. They are influencing which of your genes are expressed and which are suppressed. They are causing biological effects at the level of cellular function. The Hermetic principle that nothing escapes the law of cause and effect, that the mental plane of causation is as real and as consequential as the physical, is not a mystical claim. It is a description of documented biological mechanisms. chance is but a name for law not recognized. This phrase deserves its own section, because it is one of the most philosophically interesting statements in the entire Kybalion. Most people operate with an implicit assumption that some things are genuinely random, that some events, the accident of birth, the chance encounter, the unexpected diagnosis, the opportunity that arrived from nowhere, are not the effects of prior causes, but simply the eruption of genuine randomness into the causal order. The principle of cause and effect says this appearance of randomness is always a product of incomplete knowledge about the causes, not of the absence of causes. This is not merely a philosophical position. It has been confirmed in physics at multiple scales. Classical physics appeared to have room for genuine randomness in the behavior of chaotic systems, systems so sensitive to initial conditions that their future behavior is practically unpredictable. But this is epistemic randomness, randomness produced by our ignorance of the precise initial conditions, not ontological randomness. The causes are there. We cannot see them with sufficient precision to predict the effects, but the law holds. Quantum mechanics introduces something more genuinely challenging: the apparently irreducible randomness of quantum events. The specific moment at which a radioactive atom decays, the specific outcome when a quantum measurement is made. These appear, in the standard interpretation, to be genuinely random, not caused by any prior state but arising from the fundamental probabilistic nature of quantum reality. The Hermetic tradition would say, and some interpretations of quantum mechanics would agree, that this randomness is apparent rather than genuine, that the quantum event has causes operating at a level of reality not yet accessible to current scientific instruments, that what appears to be ontological randomness is epistemic, a limitation of knowledge, not a feature of the law. Whether this is correct is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the practical implication of the principle, regardless of the physics. When something appears to happen by chance, when an encounter seems accidental, when an opportunity seems to arrive from nowhere, when a circumstance seems entirely unrelated to anything you have caused, the invitation of this principle is to look more carefully, to ask what causal web produced this event, to ask what in the inner life may have been part of that web, operating through mechanisms too subtle to track directly. Not to claim that you caused everything that happens to you. That would be both philosophically incorrect and psychologically cruel. Some of what happens to people is the effect of causes entirely outside their influence. The principle does not say otherwise. But to maintain the assumption that what appears random might have causes worth investigating is a different quality of relationship with experience than the assumption that things just happen. It produces a different quality of attention, a different kind of learning, a different relationship with the events of a life. The responsibility that comes with this. Here is the part of this principle that requires the most careful handling. If the inner life is a causal factor in the outer life, if what you are being is part of what produces what you are experiencing, then there is a form of responsibility implied that most people find genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Not guilt. That distinction matters enormously, and it is worth making explicitly. Guilt is the judgment that something that happened was your fault and that you should feel bad about it. Responsibility is the recognition that you have causal influence over something and can therefore make choices about how to use that influence going forward. The principle of cause and effect is not about guilt. The patterns of mental causation that have been generating your outer circumstances were mostly not consciously chosen. They were installed by prior causes, by childhood experience, by cultural conditioning, by the accumulated effects of everything that shaped your inner life before you had the awareness or the tools to work with it consciously. You did not choose the beliefs running in the background. You received them. But you are now here, reading or listening to a book that is giving you some of the understanding needed to work with the mental plane of causation more consciously. And that changes the situation. Not completely, not all at once, not in a way that gives you control over all the causes operating in your life. The principle is not a promise of omnipotence, but it gives you a different relationship with your inner life. It gives you a reason, a causal reason, not merely a moral or psychological one, to attend to the quality of your consciousness, to work with the beliefs and emotional defaults and habitual mental patterns, not just because they are affecting your well-being in the moment, but because they are causes. Real, operating, consequential causes of the quality of the life that is continuing to unfold. The inner is upstream, work upstream. Living the principle. The practical consequence of genuinely understanding the Hermetic principle of cause and effect is a specific shift in orientation. It is the shift from asking, "Why is this happening to me?" to asking what caused this, and what am I causing right now? The first question places you as the passive recipient of effects. It positions you at the end of the causal chain, receiving what arrives, with no acknowledged role in having generated it. The second question places you within the causal web. It acknowledges that you are both an effect, the product of countless prior causes, many of them not of your choosing, and a cause. A real, active, continuously operating cause of effects that will ripple forward in ways you may not be able to fully track. This is not a comfortable orientation. Comfortable is believing that most of what happens to you is outside your influence, and that your job is simply to navigate it as skillfully as possible. The principle of cause and effect says the navigation itself is causal. The quality of consciousness you bring to each moment, the beliefs running, the emotional frequency broadcasting, the quality of attention you are directing, is part of the causal web that is generating the next moment. Nothing escapes the law, including, especially, the inner life. Chapter 7. The Principle of Gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. Before we go any further, let's clear something up. The principle of gender is the most misunderstood of the 7, and the misunderstanding happens immediately, at the level of the word itself. Because when most people hear gender, they think of biological sex, of social roles, of the cultural conversation around masculine and feminine that occupies so much contemporary attention. The Hermetic principle of gender is not about any of that. It is not a statement about men and women. It is not a hierarchy that places one above the other. It is not a defense of traditional gender roles or a challenge to them. It has nothing to do with the social or political dimensions of the gender conversation. What it is, stated plainly in the Hermetic sense, is a description of two fundamental creative principles that operate at every level of existence. Two complementary modes of being that are present in everything, that must work together for creation to occur, and that every individual human being, regardless of biology or identity, contains and must learn to work with consciously. The Hermetic tradition chose the word gender because it was the closest available word in the Western philosophical vocabulary for what it was pointing at. Other traditions have used different words: yin and yang, Shakti and Shiva, active and receptive, logos and eros. The specific vocabulary is less important than the principle it is pointing at. With that clear, let's look at what the principle actually says. The two principles. The masculine principle, in the Hermetic sense, is the directed, active, initiating force. The principle of focused intention, of will, of the clear, specific signal sent into the generative field. It is the quality of knowing what you want and moving toward it with precision, of defining, of acting, of initiating. The feminine principle is the receptive, generative, creative force, the principle of openness and reception, of the capacity to receive a signal and bring it to fullness, of gestation, of allowing, of the deep intelligence that knows how to take what is given and bring it to birth. It is not passive. The feminine principle in the Hermetic sense is extraordinarily active, but its activity is generative rather than directed. It creates from the inside rather than forcing from the outside. Neither principle is superior. Neither is complete without the other. This is not a hierarchy. It is a description of the two complementary forces that together constitute all genuine creation. Think about any act of creation: a piece of music, a business, a relationship, a child. In every case, there is a directed initiating element, the intention, the seed, the specific act of beginning. And there is a receptive generative element, the medium that receives the initiation and brings it to fullness in ways the initiation alone could never accomplish. The composer who has the idea, the directed masculine initiation, and the composer's developed musical intelligence that takes the idea and allows it to unfold, to grow, to become more than the original intention, the receptive feminine generativity. The seed, masculine, the soil, feminine, the specific asking, masculine. The open field of possibility that receives the asking and generates the response, feminine. Creation requires both, always, at every scale of existence, on every plane. The individual and both principles. Here is where the principle becomes immediately relevant to every listener regardless of biology, identity, or any other dimension of selfhood. You contain both principles. You were born with them. They are not qualities some people have and others lack. They are the two complementary creative modes available to every human consciousness. The question the Hermetic tradition asks is not which principle you have access to. It is which principle you are currently overdeveloping and which you are underusing. Because both an imbalance toward the masculine principle and an imbalance toward the feminine principle produce characteristic failures of creation. The person overdeveloped in the masculine principle, who is all directed will, focused intention, relentless forward motion, generates a particular sound of life. They are productive. They are decisive. They can initiate with great clarity. And they consistently find that their creations feel somehow thin, that the results they produce don't have the fullness they imagined, that they are achieving things, but the things feel hollow once achieved, that the people in their lives feel managed rather than met. What is missing is the feminine principle, the capacity to receive rather than only to direct, the willingness to be open to what the creative process wants to become, rather than insisting it become only what was originally intended. The ability to inhabit the generative unknown, the space between the intention and its fulfillment, with trust rather than anxiety. The person overdeveloped in the feminine principle, who is all receptivity, all openness, all allowing, generates a different kind of life. They are sensitive. They are attuned to others and to the field around them. They have extraordinary generative potential, and they consistently find that their potential does not become actual, that they can feel what wants to be created, but cannot initiate the specific acts that would bring it into being. That they wait for the right moment, the right circumstance, the right inspiration, and the right moment does not arrive because no directed intention was sent to call it forth. What is missing is the masculine principle, the clarity of intention, the willingness to initiate even in the absence of complete certainty, the capacity to direct the generative energy toward a specific form. Genuine creativity, at every scale, in every domain, requires the conscious integration of both. This is the whole of manifestation. Here is something worth stating plainly, because it synthesizes everything the previous 6 principles have been building toward. The entire conversation about manifestation, about how to work with the universe to bring desired realities into being, is, in the Hermetic view, a conversation about the conscious integration of these 2 principles. The masculine principle is the clear, emotionally coherent intention, the specific signal sent into the field, the quality of focused, directed, genuine desire that collapses possibility into probability. This is what Chapter 4 of The Frequency of You was about. Intention from wholeness. The directed asking that comes from genuine inner clarity rather than from anxious lack. The feminine principle is the surrender, the trust, the open receptivity that allows what has been initiated to arrive in its own form and in its own timing. This is what Chapter 5 was about. The art of letting the river flow, the release of the grip, the wu-wei that allows the generative process to do what it knows how to do without the interference of anxious monitoring. You cannot manifest from the masculine principle alone. The directed intention without the receptive surrender is grasping. It is the closed fist that cannot receive what the open hand could hold. It generates effortful, forced, brittle results, and frequently no results at all, because the anxiety of the grasping disrupts the very field it is trying to influence. You cannot manifest from the feminine principle alone. The open receptivity without the directed intention is diffusion. It is the fertile field with no seed, full of potential, generating nothing specific, because nothing specific was initiated. The Hermetic Principle of Gender says creation, genuine, lasting, fully realized creation, requires the conscious, skilled integration of both. Set the intention with full clarity and full emotional coherence. That is the masculine principle doing its work. Then release. Open. Trust the generative process. Allow what has been initiated to come to fullness in its own way and in its own time. That is the feminine principle doing its work. This is not a sequence you go through once and then you're done. It is a continuous rhythm, like the rhythm of breath, in which initiation and reception alternate, each one enabling the other, neither one complete without the other. On all planes, the Kybalion says the principle of gender manifests on all planes. The masculine and feminine principles are not only relevant to human creativity and manifestation, they operate at every level of existence. At the physical plane, matter and energy. Matter, in classical physics, is relatively stable and form-giving. It holds shape. Energy is dynamic and penetrating. It moves through and transforms. In quantum field theory, the same dynamic appears in different clothing. The wave function as the receptive field of possibility, the measurement as the directed initiation that collapses possibility into actuality. At the mental plane, focused thought, and open awareness. The deliberate concentration of attention on a specific object or intention is the masculine principle in mental operation. The open, diffuse, non-directed awareness of meditation, the quality of attention that is present without being attached to any particular content, is the feminine principle in mental operation. Both are necessary for a fully functioning mind. The focused attention, without the open awareness, becomes rigid, narrow, incapable of the associative leaps that produce genuine insight. The open awareness without the focused attention becomes pleasant but unproductive, full of impressions that never cohere into anything actionable. At the spiritual plane, the Kybalion's most expansive application of the principle, the infinite intelligence that mentalism calls the All expresses both principles simultaneously and in perfect integration. The All initiates the creative impulse that gives rise to the universe, and the All receives the infinite generative capacity that allows the universe to unfold into all of its specific forms. The masculine and feminine principles, in the Hermetic view, are not human concepts applied to a neutral universe. They are fundamental features of the creative intelligence that underlies existence. The creative conversation. There is an image I want to leave you with from this principle, because I think it captures something that pure concept cannot. Genuine creation, at any scale, in any domain, is a conversation. Not a monologue. Not a single voice directing, and a silent world complying. A genuine exchange between the directing, initiating, specific asking of the masculine principle and the generative, responsive, wildly intelligent answering of the feminine principle. The most creative people in any field know this, though they may not use this language. They have learned that the work is not fully under their control, that the initiated intention, the seed, will grow in ways they did not entirely predict, that the most extraordinary things that emerge in creative work are often not what was planned, but what the generative process produced when it was given both a clear initiation and genuine freedom to respond. The composer who sets a theme and then follows where it leads, the writer who knows where the story starts and then discovers where the characters take it, the scientist who poses a precise question and then follows the data wherever it goes, the entrepreneur who identifies a genuine need and then stays radically open to the specific form the solution needs to take. All of them are working with both principles, the masculine precision of the initiation, the feminine openness to what the creative process generates in response, and the quality of what they produce, when it is genuinely extraordinary, tends to have a quality that reflects the integration. It is both specific and rich, both clear and full, both intended and surprising, both shaped by human intention and larger than any human intention could have fully anticipated. That is what the integration of the masculine and feminine principles in creative work actually looks like. Not a 50-50 split managed by conscious decision. A fluid, ongoing, mutually responsive conversation between the two modes of creative being that every human consciousness contains. The seventh principle as the keystone. There is a reason the Kybalion places gender last. It is not an afterthought. It is the keystone, the principle that, when understood, shows how all the other six fit together. Mentalism establishes that the universe is mental, that consciousness is the ground of reality. Gender shows how consciousness creates, through the interaction of its masculine and feminine principles, the directing and the receiving, the initiation and the response. Correspondence establishes that the same patterns operate at every scale. Gender shows what the fundamental pattern is, the creative interplay of two complementary principles, present at every plane and operating the same way at the cosmic scale as at the personal. Vibration establishes that everything is in motion. Gender shows what the motion is moving toward, the continuous act of creation through the ongoing conversation between initiation and reception. Polarity establishes that everything has two poles on a spectrum. Gender refines this. The two poles are not simply opposites on the same scale. They are two distinct but complementary modes of being whose integration is the mechanism of all creation. Rhythm establishes that everything flows in and out. Gender names the forces in the flow, the initiating masculine pulse and the receptive feminine return, alternating in the rhythm that is the heartbeat of existence. Cause and effect establishes that everything that happens has causes operating on multiple planes. Gender shows the deepest causal structure. All creation is the effect of the interaction between the masculine principles directing cause and the feminine principles generative response. 7 principles, and the 7th is the one that shows how the other 6 are aspects of a single, unified understanding of how existence creates itself. What this leaves you with. The principle of gender leaves you with a question that is worth carrying into the rest of your life. In the domain where you most want to create, whether that is a relationship, a body of work, a financial reality, a quality of inner life, which principle are you currently overdeveloping? Are you all intention and no surrender, all directing and no receiving? Setting goals with great clarity and then anxiously monitoring their progress, rather than trusting the generative process to do what it knows how to do? Or are you all openness and no initiation, receptive, attuned, full of potential, but waiting for something to arrive rather than sending the clear, specific, emotionally coherent signal that calls it forth? The answer is honest information, not a judgment, a diagnostic, a reading of where the creative conversation has gone out of balance and where the complementary principle needs to be developed. Because creation, at every scale, on every plane, in every domain of a human life, is a conversation. Both voices are yours. Both principles are available to you. The work is learning to let them speak in genuine dialogue with each other. That dialogue, sustained and deepened over time, is what the Hermetic tradition meant by the creative life. And it begins, as all genuine creation begins, with the willingness to initiate, with the willingness to receive, with the understanding that these are not two separate things. They are the two hands of the same reaching toward the same thing.